Hey folks, thank you. Hey, okay, we got one table. Folks, I'm excited to be here. I'm a low energy. Can I get a little? Yeah, they can't hear me. I can't hear myself. I am a low energy introvert, and for the next 19 minutes and 35 seconds, I'm going to do my best impression of an engaging extrovert. I don't know how this is going to go. There we go. I can hear myself now, but it's going to be great. All right, the room is in transition. I want to settle in. As an icebreaker, I want everybody to yell out the name of their least favorite family member. One. I want to talk a little bit today about giving and then receiving effective feedback. Raise your hand nice and high if you love feedback. If it's like gets you excited in the morning, okay, we have a sociopath table over here, sprinkles over here, it's wonderful. Feedback is critical, but it's not easy for all of us. So I want to talk about a few best practices for making it a part of your organizational culture. I work for a diversity strategy firm called ReadySet. We've been partnering with From Day One for years now. It's been a great journey, and I'm excited to be here on the stage in North Cuba, talking to you all fine folks. I want to talk a little bit about the factors that make feedback difficult for us personally, interpersonally, and creating that culture. I want to talk about some ways that our own feedback pattern, our patterns around feedback and our triggers make it difficult to give challenging feedback in particular. And I also want to leave you all with some opportunities to reflect on concrete tools to deliver this more effectively. And at the end, I'm going to give you all a free something that I think you're going to like. By way of introduction, I'm from Jacksonville, the Georgia part of Florida. Is anybody here from Florida? Who is from North Florida? Who's from Jacksonville? Hey, okay, we got one. We'll talk later. We probably went to the same high school. I made books. I've been on TV. This slide always embarrasses me because I want you to think I'm important, but I don't want to talk about any of these things. We can talk about house hunters later. By a show of your voices, what do you think about when you hear the word feedback or when you're preparing for a feedback conversation? Just yell it out. Performance? Give me some feelings words. Fear. Confrontation, anxious, absolutely. So I've read your mind and I put all these words up on a slide. It's not a natural thing that a lot of us look forward to, and there's a really good reason why. I wake up in the morning, if you're anything like me, I wake up in the morning wanting to be liked by more people. So the prospect of giving somebody challenging feedback, especially if I'm having a repeat conversation, is not a lot of fun. So we recognize that it's a really unnatural and unpleasant experience for a lot of people to deliver the feedback, especially the feedback that needs to be given in a timely way. Now, why is this worth talking about? What we know is that good feedback culture is positively correlated with productivity and engagement, certainty and reduced anxiety. How many of you need to know what the future is going to look like, or at least your next few steps are going to look like in order to be fully engaged with your work? Are you like me? Okay, I see some non-committal head nods. It's wonderful. Also, psychological safety and trust. People need to know where they stand. There's something that I call the tyranny of niceness that pervades a lot of corporate cultures, where we pretend that everything's okay, we nod along, we don't give people the critical feedback, and then nobody actually knows where they stand because we know that we're trading the discomfort of real conversations for the comfort of not actually speaking the truth. So I want to walk through why that is and peel back the layers on how we can speak more directly and compassionately with our colleagues, even when we have to deliver them direct feedback. Feedback is also useful for behavior change and career advancement. What we find, particularly for people with underestimated identities, is when they make mistakes at work, they have further to fall. They have a less established professional network in a particular city. And when we think about bringing an equity mindset to this work, people with underestimated identities receive disproportionately less useful and actionable feedback than their dominant group peers. So there's a DEI imperative and a cultural imperative through line with all of this with these conversations that we're having. And finally, it's an actionable practice that we all can practice on our team and our organizations and the like. So I'm not going to make that particular point interactive, but I want to talk a little bit from a personal perspective of like what makes feedback difficult for me and what I see as a theme across a lot of the conversations that I'm having. What we recognize is that we don't like conflict. We avoid it, especially if you haven't had it for the first time. If you're stepping onto a team where feedback hasn't been normalized before, when you start down that path, it can be very uncomfortable, particularly if you have to give upwards feedback, or feedback to a colleague, or feedback to somebody that you don't manage. People are like, why are you giving me feedback? This is not necessarily. Just tell me I did a great job. That's what I want anyway. We also want to avoid dealing with the bad reactions. How many of you work with people and you need to give them feedback, but you've decided that it's not worth it? It's just not worth it. Yeah, a lot of us make that calculation. We also are operating from a place of genuinely caring about others. We don't want to demotivate people, giving them a feedback conversation and then they're beating themselves up and then you have to lift them back up and then kind of invalidate the feedback that you gave them in the first place. We don't want to hurt people's feelings and we don't want to offend people. Does this resonate with you all? What else would you add to why feedback is difficult? What about for you? What makes feedback personally difficult for you? I'd love to hear some voices. Yes, please. Finding the right words. Say more about that. Yep. Yep. Sure. How do you say things in a way that's going to be received, regardless of context? You might not have the professional proximity that would make the conversation easier. The person might be on a different team, and they might not be open to receiving the feedback that you have. Wonderful. Yes, please.
Don't make it personal. Make it more professional.
Sure. A best practice can be making it professional and not personal, and that can be really difficult when we have frustration and anger bubbling up. Maybe we've told somebody something several times, we have a direct report, and our frustration kind of spills over. And even if the feedback is really simple and it's straightforward, easy to correct, and it's innocuous feedback, if we give them the emotional energy of our frustration, they're actually going to react to our energy and not the substance of what we say. So I love the best practice of keeping it professional and not making it personal. But in practice, if you're anything like me, you sometimes slip up and tell somebody you hate them a little bit, right? It's just me, that's fine. And as I talked about, race and gender plays a huge role in how we deliver feedback. What the research shows is that women-identified folks receive more vague, less meaningful, and more sugar-coated feedback unrelated to business outcomes than male-identified counterparts. This is pervasive, and I've got some stats on the next slide that's going to drive this point home as well. People with racialized identities often receive feedback that's less authentic and less concrete than their dominant group peers as well. And what we know, Kimberly Crenshaw taught us this years ago, there's something interesting happening at the intersection of race and gender that is uniquely and disproportionately impacting Black women in the workplace. So we have to be able to have a conversation about healthy feedback patterns. We also have to talk about the ways in which all identities and bodies are not receiving that feedback equally. So what can we do? I mean, the first thing we need to do is understand what makes us so happy and what makes this happen and what makes it so difficult. This was some research that came out of Stanford's VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. They did me no favors with that name. And they looked at performance evaluations for men and women across high-tech firms and a few professional services, high-tech companies and professional services firms. More than 3/4 of the references of too aggressive, quote unquote, happened in women's reviews versus less than 1/4 in men's. There's nothing wrong with the women in here. It's the language and the bias that goes into it. And a lot of people are helpless but to perpetuate some of these biases unless we're aware of what we're doing. Again, women-identified folks disproportionately receive more feedback related to their personality and how they make people feel instead of business outcomes. We see this in interviews, we see this in mid-years. It's pervasive. Raise your hand if you've experienced this. And you see this, thank you. I really like this table. We should talk later. There's a lot going on at this table. And so does this resonate with other people as well? Do you find that this type of biased language occurs in the reviews that you either see yourself or that you're delivering or that you've gotten feedback around? I see some yes. All right. And we talk about giving effective feedback. I want to talk about 2 examples of what it should and should not look like. Ineffective feedback can be thought of as unachievable, unclear, and failure-focused. I want to spend a little bit of time here because I know a lot of us have received feedback similar to this, and I want to plot a path out of this. So you don't know what you're doing. Pretty terrible feedback to offer somebody. That lacked finesse. Or sending that make you look really bad. These things might be true, but sharing them with somebody is exceptionally demotivating, right? It's really challenging to go somewhere useful with ineffective feedback structured in this way. Effective feedback, by contrast, is actionable, it's clear, and it's focused on the future. In other words, somebody should be able to come out of the conversation about feedback able to do something differently. They should be able to repeat to themselves and to somebody else a summary of what you shared with them, which is to say it's clear, and it should also focus on the future, not rehashing the past and saying this went poorly. What can we do for the next time? And I'm actually going to read the language on the bottom because I think it's really useful. In this scenario, somebody, let's say a direct report of yours, sent a deliverable too quickly without it being reviewed, and it didn't look great. Speed is important, and pausing to do quality control before sending can ultimately save us time. Next time, please send me a draft before distributing, and we can talk through it together. What I love about this framing and this phrasing and this language is that it acknowledges the mistake without dwelling on it. And you're also acknowledging the motivation behind why the mistake took place in the first place. Speed is important, sure, but pausing to do quality control before sending can ultimately save us time. In other words, if we go too fast, it's going to set us back because we might make mistakes along the way. But then you implicate yourself in the solution, which is to say, I've got your back. Next time, please send me a draft before distributing, and we can talk through it together. If you come away from a conversation like this as compared to sending that made you look really bad, it's a night and day difference, right? There are a couple scenarios in which we might want to deliver somebody feedback, and the two categories we can think of today are post-event, which is to say right after something occurs, a presentation, a conversation, whatever the case may be, a discrete situation, or developmental. That's your mid-year, that's your ongoing, that's your check-in, that's addressing patterns of behavior that are seen over time. Crucially, we have to know what we're dealing with in terms of people's openness to receiving that feedback. How many of you like receiving critical feedback live in the moment as soon as it's available? Raise your hand nice and high. How many of you would much rather get your bearings, pour a glass of wine, close your eyes, and prepare before receiving it? Yeah, of course, like everybody is wired differently, and we need to understand what we're working with so we can develop these healthy relationship dynamics with people. Some people don't like a calendar invite on 4 p.m. on Thursday for a feedback conversation. That could really send somebody into a tailspin. I mean, I'm being sincere, but the feedback has to be delivered. There's never a great time to do it. So we have to recognize that we can build rapport and an understanding in our preferences with our colleagues in order to understand the ways in which they like to receive feedback. Any reactions, any builds before we move forward? I'd love to hear a voice. What's resonating with you? What would you add? And how does this land for you? You need both? Absolutely, absolutely. And we can talk about our preferences, so we're giving feedback to the person who's offering us feedback, and we can make that project easier over time. Thank you. Other folks? Yes, please.
I think you also need to add some good examples when you talk about development and feedback. You don't need just out of perception.
If you're going to go through the trouble of giving somebody feedback, come armed with data, come armed with examples, and make it real for somebody. It's crucial to have that in hand so you have credibility when you're talking about what it is that you're talking about. Something I'll offer you that we use internally at ReadySet, yes, we are the life of the party. It's called FLIF, Felt Like Improved and Feedback. If I was co-facilitating this session with a colleague of mine, after we got off stage, we would literally go through these and say, okay, how did it feel? And we'd focus on using feelings words instead of jumping ahead to what we would do differently. Liked, what did you like about it? I like the crowd participation. I like the setup. I like being able to hear myself. Improved, here's what I would do differently next time. And finally, feedback. Here's some feedback I have for you. Do you have any feedback for me? So by using something like this, it's really straightforward. We don't have to think about it. It's awkward to talk about feedback with somebody that you're constantly on Teams with or on Slack with or on Zoom with. So this just takes the awkwardness out of the equation. Do you want to flip this real quick? It's a really cool thing to do. And we recognize that you can also cause harm. Sometimes we deliver feedback that lands poorly. And so we also want to be equipped and prepared to repair harm in the event that it occurs. So it's not just about our motivations in sharing the feedback. We also have to recognize the impact of what we say. And we can come to the colleague on Tuesday and say, listen, I gave you some heavy feedback on Thursday. I wanted to check in now that you've had some time to sleep on it. How did it land? How are you feeling? Any feedback for me? What that shows, regardless of the nature of the conversation that you had, is that you're concerned about their well-being and that you recognize the impact of what you said. That can go a long way towards allowing that person to assimilate and receive the information instead of just feeling talked to or talked at or feeling like it was a punitive conversation. And we can apologize with specificity if it's warranted and if it's appropriate. And you don't just give somebody a blanket, I'm sorry. You say, I'm sorry for, or I'm sorry because. We can be specific to make that apology land. And the real cash value of an apology is making change for the future, right? In terms of receiving feedback, I want you to actually reflect on this. Think about a time when you had to receive challenging feedback in the past. I want you to think about what it felt like and how you reacted. What we recognize is that when people feel under stress, under duress, when they're overstimulated, when we're having some of these feedback conversations, cortisol spikes in the bloodstream, what we call the amygdala hijack takes place, which makes it really difficult for us to function as thoughtful human beings. Our habitual biases emerge. We fall back on well-worn habits that don't necessarily serve us, and rational decision-making is compromised. We might say something that we come to regret. Let's do a quick poll. In terms of trauma responses, which a lot of us are familiar with, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, how many of you are fighters? How many of you have never met a fight you didn't like to? Yeah, hand went up quickly. Okay. Raise your hand, license, you're fighters. Okay, table of fighters, that totally tracks. Flight, how many of you are like, get me out of here? Conflict, I want to bet, understand. Freeze, how many of you are deer in headlights? I'm shocked, I don't know what to say. Yeah, I understand. And fawn, how many of you are like, oh, you're so right, I'm gonna get out of here, yeah. So these are really common trauma responses to stress, and the key here is to be clear about the kind of person you are under these circumstances so you can start to communicate this. And once we become more aware of our preferences and our tendencies under stress, we can actually build a workflow around them. If you're the kind of person that reaches for defensiveness and that fight response initially, we can receive the feedback with data, we can receive that in advance, and we can engage in a conversation around that instead of feeling like the door is closed to the dialogue here. But the point here is that it's really critical to understand how we're wired in order to effectively respond to and engage with the product of feedback. The things to keep in mind for any type of feedback that occurs is it actionable? Can somebody do something with this insight? Can somebody do something with the knowledge? Is it clear and specific? Is the nature of the challenge clearly documented and specific to a situation that somebody can learn from? And also, is it future and goals focused? Have you given somebody something actionable to change for the future and to align with their goals for growth and development? Before I leave, I want to offer you all something so this is basically a snapshot of really like a 2-hour training, half-day training, however you want to spin it. This is a very compressed version. Obviously, there would be a lot more interactivity and dialogue in this, but what we've made available to you is the online version of this course. So there's a 5 tips for giving effective feedback that'll be available for you. If you point your iPhones or your devices at this, it'll take you to a landing page, and you can also see the online version of a course that we deliver. It's self-paced, it's on our platform called New Day, which allows you to engage with this for your team if that's of interest to you all. I have about a minute and a half. Any reactions, any feedback? Anybody want to share anything about what's worked for them or what's effective from a feedback perspective on your team or your organization? Yes, please.
Asking for feedback, and sometimes as leaders to ask your employees for feedback yourself.
It's such a huge sign of maturity and a modeling of equity when you say, do you have any feedback for me? You make that habitual after every presentation, every conversation, any feedback for me. I love that. I saw another hand. Yes, please.
We have our frontline leaders, we ask them to set monthly check-ins so that they can just talk about anything, but then that presents a regular opportunity to provide feedback if it's necessary. So it's not just, hey, I'm scheduling a meeting, if you're in trouble, so come talk to me. It's just a regular opportunity to get to know them better, have a one-on-one connection, to build that relationship, to better present feedback when
I love that. Regularly scheduled feedback calendar in advance can take the sting and the awkwardness out of it when you know to expect that on your monthly check-in with another person. Anyone else? All right, yes, please.
You will be how to create that culture, right, of feedback.
Sure.
Everyone giving feedback, fearless feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay to feel fear around it. I think the biggest thing that I found that makes it easier is practice. When you establish the rapport, when you make it clear that you're coming from a place of wanting to support the person's growth and their development, and you invite that feedback as well, I think we can only control what we can control. We can start with that one-to-one relationship. Then we normalize it on our team, and we call people out and reward them publicly for that behavior, giving that courageous feedback, and then hopefully that will spread within the organization, create that kind of culture that you would want. Thanks so much for your attention, folks, and your engagement. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you all later.